We're back in the discussion room, and today is helping kids with stress and trauma. This is coming from a licensed therapist, and I want to dive into kids' stress or trauma. A lot of times we minimize kids when they're going through traumatic events or a stressful episode in their life because, in our mind, they're kids. But kids have emotions. You have to remember that when you were a kid, what did it feel like? What were things that you went through? They felt very real to you. It wasn't minimized or smaller because it was a kid, it was intense. And it was a lot to process. So don't minimize your kid's trauma. So your kid is stressed out, or they're going through traumatic events, or they've had compound trauma. Now we have this maladaptive behavior. And maladaptive behavior is just an unproductive or unwanted behavior that is being displayed from the child, right? A lot of times we have to change the narrative. If you remember when we were growing up, if it was a boy, man, John is bad. He's bad. Or if it was a girl, Tiffany. Tiffany's really fast. But did we get down to the root of the issue? What is causing these behaviors that we're seeing that we don't want? We have to understand kids, and we can't minimize them just because they're kids. So now that we understand kids have stress, they have trauma, and their response might be maladaptive behaviors, now we have to examine you as a parent, right? Now, growing up in my household, and it might not be the same for yours, we weren't rewarded for doing what we were supposed to. You were expected to do that. So therefore, you weren't rewarded for that. But then you have to think about the flip side. Now I'm cutting up in school, or I'm doing things that you don't want me to do. And you reined me down with attention. What does that teach the child, right? Well, that's a learned behavior. Now the kid understands when I do good, I'm barely recognized. When I do bad, the world is ending and I get all the attention from my mother and my father. This is where I need to place my efforts into to get a need or a want met from my parents. Got to redirect that. So we want to, one, change that narrative. And then two, we want to redirect that energy and that attention that we're placing into kids when they're going through a traumatic experience and how we respond to it. How you respond to it is almost as equally as important as the behavior itself. Starting to sound familiar? You could almost apply it to every area, right? We have to remember that the kids of this generation, they don't get a break. The trauma or the stress that we might have endured at school, at home, there were breaks from there. But now these kids in this generation, they don't get a break. They have social media, which constantly keeps them in either a really good mood or a really stressed out mood, but there's never a break and there's never a turn off switch unless you as the parent regulates that. So they don't get those breaks. Kids are going through just as much stress and trauma as adults, and they're living through the stress and the trauma that you also place them in. So think about it. If you are in a violent relationship and they watch this man or this woman beat up on their significant other, the children are enduring that with you, even though they might not be the one that might be physically abused, or they may be, but they're watching it. And so that can be just as traumatic. And then they have everything else that goes on outside that's pressuring them, whether it's to do good in school or their peer pressure to be involved in other activities. You have to understand and sit down and talk to your kids. We're going to kill the generation of children don't have thoughts, children don't have opinions, children don't have feelings, because you saying it doesn't make it any less inaccurate and not true. They have feelings. And you have to sit down and have conversations with them to understand and get to the root of what is causing the maladaptive behavior. And most often, you're going to find there's some kind of traumatic event or stress. And no matter how small it might seem to you, remember that it's huge to them. And you have to remember that there's two major differences between you and the child. One, hopefully now as an adult, you've learned some level of coping skills. Hopefully. But we have to remember that no one taught us how to be healthy adults. Often when I ask an adult that question, they usually pause and they don't have the ability to answer that. But if you do have some coping skills, you have some strength to build off of. The kids may or may not have any coping skills at this point. A second thing that you also have to remember is that you have the ability to regulate your moods, hopefully. The child usually doesn't have the ability to regulate their mood. So they're going through all the stress and the trauma, and they have two key factors that you have that they don't have. And that might be that gap of understanding or empathy that will help bridge. So I hope this has been insightful. I hope this has been impactful. Please stay tuned in. We're going to continue to go over different topics that are related to mental health, not just kids, but it's important that our kids know that they are loved, they are cherished, and that it's not understood without words. I want them to understand it with words, and I want them to also understand it with your actions. So it's important that we step up and step forward. There's no handbook on parenting, but why not help each other, right? I am your mental health personal trainer. I'm also a licensed therapist. Stay tuned. Mental health is true wealth.